March 17th, 1944. 32,000 feet above Wewak, New Guinea. The sky stretched blue and infinite, the air thin enough to taste metal. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced fighter pilots with 64 confirmed kills, watched a formation of American P-38 Lightnings below him at 28,000 feet. They were escorting B-24 Liberators toward the Japanese airfield, and Sakai smiled behind his oxygen mask. He'd fought P-38 seconds before. He knew their weakness. At altitude, they climbed like wounded birds. Sakai rolled his Zero into a dive, his 3 wingmen following in perfect formation. The plan was textbook: drop from above, use the sun as cover, hit the trailing lightning before his formation could react, then climb away before the Americans could pursue. The Zero's legendary agility would do the rest. At high altitude, American fighters couldn't follow a climbing Zero. It was physics, it was doctrine, it was survival. But what happened in the next 18 seconds would shatter everything Sakai thought he knew about the P-38 Lightning. The American pilot spotted them. Instead of diving away or trying to turn, he did something that made no tactical sense. He pulled up, hard. The twin-engine fighter clawed for altitude, climbing directly toward Sakai's diving attack. For a moment, Sakai thought the American had panicked, was trying to meet the threat head-on in some suicidal gesture. Then the numbers stopped making sense. The P-38 was climbing at a rate Sakai had never witnessed from that aircraft. 4,000 feet per minute, maybe more. In the 6 seconds it took Sakai's Zero to close from 32,000 to 29,000 feet, the Lightning had climbed from 28,000 to 30,000. The American had stolen Sakai's altitude advantage and was now positioning above him. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Sakai's tactical situation had inverted. He was no longer the hunter dropping from the sun. He was the target, exposed below an enemy who shouldn't have been able to reach that position. The P-38's nose dropped slightly, and Sakai saw the wink of muzzle flashes from its clustered nose guns. 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, all firing through the propeller arc with no convergence issues. He broke hard right, the Zero responding instantly, but tracers slashed past his canopy close enough to hear them crack the air. His wingman wasn't as lucky. The concentrated fire stream from the Lightning caught him in the engine cowling, and the Zero came apart in a spray of metal and burning fuel. Sakai dove away, his mind racing faster than his aircraft. What had just happened? How had a P-38 climbed that fast at altitude where American fighters were supposed to be helpless? By the time he reached his airfield at Wewak, Sakai was already filing a mental report that his commanders wouldn't want to hear. The Americans had changed something fundamental. The P-38 Lightning was no longer the same airplane they'd been fighting for the past year. It had transformed into something far more dangerous. And across the Pacific Theater, from the Solomons to the Philippines, Japanese pilots were discovering the same terrifying truth. The tactical advantage they'd relied on, the ability to climb away from American fighters at will, had vanished. The sky had new rules, and they were written in the contrails of P-38 seconds that climbed like nothing the Japanese had ever faced before. To understand how completely this transformation shocked Japanese pilots, you have to go back to where it all began. Back to October 1942, when the P-38 Lightning first arrived in the Pacific Theater carrying a reputation it couldn't yet fulfill. On paper, the Lightning looked like the ultimate fighter. Twin Allison V, 1,710 engines, producing 1,475 horsepower each, a top speed of 414 miles per hour, heavy armament concentrated in the nose, long range for escort missions. Lockheed's engineers had designed it to dominate. But paper doesn't account for North African heat or the thin air at 30,000 feet. Those early P-38 seconds, the F and G models, suffered from a critical flaw that nearly killed the program. Above 20,000 feet, their supercharger intercoolers couldn't reject enough heat. Hot compressed air entering the cylinders meant less oxygen per combustion cycle. Less oxygen meant less power. Pilots filed reports that read like death sentences. Aircraft sluggish above 22,000 feet, unable to maintain climb rate, enemy fighters climbing away at will. The Luftwaffe in North Africa exploited it. Messerschmitt Bf 109Gs would climb above American formations and dive through them repeatedly, knowing the P-38 seconds couldn't pursue vertically. In one engagement over Tunisia in November 1942, an entire squadron of Lightnings lost 4 aircraft without scoring a single kill. The German pilots simply climbed away after each pass. The Japanese, reading intelligence reports about P-38 performance in Europe, learned the same lesson. Attack from above, make your pass, climb away. The Americans can't follow. It became standard doctrine taught to every Zero pilot facing the twin-engine fighter. Between late 1942 and mid-1943, that doctrine worked flawlessly. Then, something changed. Not through official channels or engineering committees, but through the grease-stained hands of a mechanic in North Africa who looked at an intercooler system and decided the manual was wrong. He bypassed thermostatic valves, locked intercooler exit doors in the full open position, removed restrictive baffles, anything to flood more cooling air through the system. The modification was unauthorized, potentially dangerous, and absolutely effective. Pilots flying modified P-38 seconds reported 12 to 15%, improved climb rates at altitude. Engine temperatures stayed within safe limits. Most importantly, they could finally pursue climbing enemies at altitudes where they'd previously been helpless. Word spread faster than any official memo. One squadron would modify their aircraft, pilots from another base would visit and see the results, and suddenly mechanics across the theatre were implementing the same fix. By spring 1943, hundreds of P-38 seconds in North Africa and the Mediterranean were flying with field-modified intercoolers. But that was only the beginning. Lockheed's engineers at Burbank, initially horrified by the unauthorized modifications, eventually swallowed their pride and incorporated the lessons into production aircraft. The P-38J model, entering service in August 1943, featured completely redesigned intercooler systems with 25% more surface area and revised ducting that maintained maximum cooling airflow. The P-38 liters, arriving in June 1944, took it even further. New intercooler housings with streamlined internal passages, larger exit doors, control systems that prioritized cooling over temperature stability. The result was nearly 200 extra horsepower at 25,000 feet compared to the early models that had struggled so badly. Rate of climb to 30,000 feet improved by 30%. Maximum sustainable altitude jumped from around 33,000 feet to over 40,000. The P-38 liters could maintain a climb rate of 4,000 feet per minute all the way to 25,000 feet, then sustain 3,500 feet per minute to 30,000. For Japanese pilots trained to exploit the Lightning's altitude weakness, these numbers represented a fundamental shift in combat mathematics. The tactic that had saved their lives for 18 months, climbing away from American fighters, suddenly stopped working, and nobody had told them why. Imagine being Lieutenant Commander Takeo Tanimizu, leading a flight of Zeros over Rabaul in September 1943. You're at 28,000 feet, the altitude where you own the sky. Below, you spot 6 P-38 seconds escorting a bomber formation at 24,000. You position your flight for a classic diving attack. The Americans see you coming. They don't run. They don't dive away for speed. They pull up into a climbing turn, all 6 Lightnings clawing for altitude. Your training says this is suicide for them. You expect to watch them struggle, gain maybe 1,500 feet per minute at best, while your Zeros climb at 3,000 feet per minute and position for a perfect deflection shot. Instead, the P-38 seconds climb at nearly the same rate you do. Within 90 seconds, they're at your altitude, turning inside your formation, their heavy nose guns tracking targets. 2 of your wingmen are dead before you can process what's happening. The others scatter, and you're left diving away, the hunter becoming the hunted. When you land at Rabaul, your hands are still shaking, not from fear alone, but from the cognitive dissonance of watching an American fighter do something that shouldn't be possible. That night, in the briefing room lit by kerosene lamps, you try to explain it to your squadron mates. The Americans have changed their aircraft. The P-38 is different now. It climbs like one of ours. They don't believe you. They think you made a tactical error or misjudged altitude. But over the next 3 weeks, other pilots return with similar stories. The Americans are reaching altitudes they couldn't before. They're pursuing climbing Zeros and catching them. The old doctrine isn't working. By October 1943, Japanese tactical manuals were being hastily revised. New guidance warned that P-38 Lightnings could no longer be reliably escaped through climbing maneuvers at altitude. Pilots were instructed to engage, only with energy advantage and numerical superiority. Never assume altitude equals safety. But rewriting manuals doesn't erase muscle memory or tactical instinct. For 18 months, Japanese pilots had learned one fundamental truth. If an American gets behind you, climb away. The Zero's superior rate of climb at altitude was your escape card, your survival guarantee. Now that card had been removed from the deck, but the instinct to play it remained. The psychological impact was devastating. Combat isn't just about physics and performance numbers, it's about confidence, about knowing your aircraft's capabilities so thoroughly that tactics become reflexive. When those capabilities shift underneath you, when the rules change mid-game, doubt creeps in. Japanese after-action reports from late 1943 through 1944 show the pattern clearly. Pilots hesitated. They second-guessed their training. Where they once committed to attacks with absolute confidence in their escape plan, they now held back, worried that the Americans might have other surprises waiting. One captured Japanese intelligence report, translated after the war, contained a chilling paragraph. American P-38 aircraft observed over Wewak on March 17, 1944, demonstrated climb performance inconsistent with previous encounters. Estimated rate of climb exceeds 4,000 feet per minute at altitude above 28,000 feet. Previous tactical guidance regarding altitude escape may no longer be reliable. Recommend defensive posture until further analysis completed. That defensive posture recommendation represented a complete reversal of Japanese fighter doctrine. The Zero had been designed as an offensive weapon, meant to seek out and destroy enemies through superior agility and climb rate. Now, Japanese commanders were advising caution, defensive tactics, and avoiding engagement unless conditions were perfect. The Americans, meanwhile, were learning to exploit their new advantage with ruthless efficiency. Captain Thomas Maguire of the 475th Fighter Group, who would eventually become America's second highest-scoring ace, developed tactics specifically designed around the P-38's improved altitude performance. He called it the Chandelle ambush. His flight would patrol at 24 to 26,000 feet, appearing vulnerable to diving attacks from above. When Japanese fighters took the bait and dove down, Maguire's wingmen would immediately execute a maximum rate climb. The diving Japanese would make their pass, assuming they could climb away safely afterward. Instead, they'd find P-38 seconds climbing up to meet them at the top of their escape climb, sitting perfectly in position for deflection shots. The tactic worked because it exploited Japanese expectations. Their training said American fighters couldn't climb effectively at that altitude. Their muscle memory told them to climb away after a diving attack. Both assumptions were now fatally outdated. On November 2nd, 1943, Maguire used this exact tactic over Wewak. 8 Zeros dove through his formation, attacking B-25 bombers at 23,000 feet. Maguire's flight of 4 P-38 seconds climbed aggressively, reaching 29,000 feet just as the Japanese pulled out of their diving attacks and began climbing away. The Zeros found themselves climbing into a wall of 50 caliber fire. 3 went down immediately. 2 more broke off and dove away, abandoning the fight. Maguire's flight lost 0 aircraft and saved the entire bomber formation. His after-action report contained one sentence that spread through every P-38 squadron in theatre. Enemy tactics unchanged. Enemy expectations fatal. By early 1944, the pattern was clear across the Pacific. Japanese pilots who'd once owned the vertical dimension of air combat were being systematically destroyed by P-38 seconds that refused to play by the old rules. The tactical mathematics had inverted. Where once altitude meant safety for Japanese fighters, it now meant opportunity for American ones. P-38 squadrons began conducting what they called altitude sweeps, climbing to 32 or 33,000 feet and loitering above known Japanese patrol routes. When enemy fighters appeared below at their normal operating altitude of 26 to 28,000 feet, the P-38 seconds would dive down with massive speed advantage. If the Japanese tried to climb away, the Lightnings would simply match their climb rate and gun them down. If they dove away, the P-38 seconds would follow them down, use their superior dive speed to close distance, then climb back up faster than the Japanese could pursue. It was a tactical checkmate written in physics and engineering. The Americans now controlled every dimension of the fight: speed, altitude, climb rate, and dive performance. The only advantage the Zero retained was its tight turning radius at lower speeds, but that advantage meant nothing if you couldn't force the P-38 into a slow-speed turning fight. And the American pilots, having learned hard lessons over 18 months of combat, simply refused to turn with Zeros. They fought vertically, using altitude and energy management, the same principles that would define jet combat 2 decades later. Lieutenant Yasuhiko Kuroe discovered this new reality on December 9, 1943, over Finchhafen. He was leading a section of 4 Zeros at 27,000 feet when they spotted a lone P-38 below them at 23,000, apparently separated from its formation. It looked like an easy kill. Kuroe signaled his wingmen and rolled into a diving attack. The American pilot saw them coming and did exactly what Kuroe expected. He pulled up into a climb, trying to gain altitude before the Zeros could close distance. Textbook defensive maneuver and textbook mistake. Except the P-38 didn't climb like Kuroe remembered. It accelerated upward with shocking speed, its twin engines roaring at maximum power, the turbo superchargers forcing compressed air into cylinders that were suddenly producing far more power than any P-38 Kuro had fought before. Within 30 seconds, the American had climbed 4,000 feet. Kuro pressed his attack, still confident. His Zero could climb at 3,000 feet per minute at this altitude. He'd close the gap, make his shot, then climb away before any other Americans could intervene. But the gap wasn't closing. The P-38 maintained its climb rate, matching the Zero almost foot for foot, and then Kuro realized his mistake. The American wasn't running, he was maneuvering. The Lightning leveled off at 31,000 feet, then executed a climbing turn that brought it around in a wide arc, positioning above and behind Kuro's formation. The hunter had become the hunted in less than 90 seconds. Kuroe shouted a warning and broke hard left. His wingmen scattered. The P-38 dove through their formation, its concentrated nose armament raking across 1 Zero's fuselage. The Japanese fighter staggered, trailing smoke, then fell into a spin. The American pilot didn't pursue. He pulled up into another climb, regaining altitude, and disappeared into the sun. When Kuroe landed at his base that evening, his crew chief noticed something unusual. The veteran pilot, normally calm and precise in his debriefings, was agitated, speaking rapidly, gesturing at the sky. "The Americans have new engines," he kept saying, "or new fuel. Something has changed. We can't fight them the same way anymore." But there were no new engines. The Allison Von 1000, 710 seconds in those P-38Js and Ls, were fundamentally the same power plants that had been in the F and G models. What had changed was everything around them: the intercooler system, the ducting, the airflow management, all the unglamorous support systems that let those engines breathe properly at altitude. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The thermodynamics were brutally simple. Air temperature drops about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit for every 1,000 feet of altitude. At 30,000 feet, ambient air temperature hovers around -48 degrees Fahrenheit, but air compressed by a turbo supercharger can reach 300 degrees before it enters the intercooler. The intercooler's job was to extract as much of that heat as possible, cooling the compressed air before it entered the cylinders. Cooler air is denser. Denser air contains more oxygen molecules per cubic inch. More oxygen means more complete combustion, which means more power. Early P-38 seconds had intercoolers that worked adequately at moderate altitudes and temperatures, but at 30,000 feet in combat conditions, with engines running at maximum continuous power, those intercoolers became bottlenecks. The thermostatic valves that controlled cooling airflow were calibrated for peacetime test conditions, not for sustained high-power operations in combat. The field modifications in North Africa had proven that if you forced maximum airflow through the intercoolers, damn the careful temperature management, you could drop intake air temperatures by 20 to 30 degrees. That might not sound dramatic, but at altitude, it was the difference between an engine producing 70% power and an engine producing 90% power. Lockheed's engineers had taken that crude field fix and refined it into production aircraft. The P-38J's intercoolers had 25% more surface area. The ducting was redesigned to minimize turbulence and maximize airflow. The exit doors were larger and stayed open longer under high power settings. Every change served one purpose: get more cooling air through the system. The P-38 liters went even further. Engineers redesigned the entire induction system, from the turbo supercharger outlets to the cylinder intake ports. They streamlined internal passages, eliminated sharp bends that caused turbulence, and increased duct cross-sections to reduce air velocity and pressure losses. The result was an engine that could maintain high manifold pressure all the way to 40,000 feet. For Japanese pilots trained to exploit altitude as their primary defensive advantage, these technical improvements translated into a terrifying tactical reality. There was nowhere to run. The vertical dimension of combat, once their sanctuary, had become a killing field. Major Hiroshi Okamura, a Japanese ace with 19 confirmed victories, wrote in his diary on January 22, 1944, after an engagement over Truk, "Fought American twin-engine fighters today. They climbed to our altitude and beyond. I have never seen this before. Our advantage is disappearing. How do we fight an enemy who can do everything we can do and carries twice the ammunition?" That last point was critical. The Zero carried 60 rounds per 20mm cannon and between 500 and 700 rounds per 7.7mm machine gun. A Zero pilot had to be precise, conservative with ammunition, making every burst count. The P-38 liters carried 150 rounds of 20mm ammunition and 500 rounds per 50 caliber machine gun. American pilots could afford to fire longer bursts, to spray and pray, to saturate a zone with lead. Combined with superior climb rate and altitude performance, this firepower advantage turned engagements into slaughter. Japanese pilots couldn't escape vertically, couldn't outlast the Americans in sustained combat, and couldn't absorb the punishment that P-38 seconds could deliver. The impact rippled across the entire Pacific theater through early 1944. At Rabaul, Japanese commanders stopped sending Zeros above 25,000 feet unless absolutely necessary. They conserved their dwindling force of experienced pilots, refusing to commit them to fights where the Americans held every advantage. Over the Philippines in October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, P-38 seconds from the 475th Fighter Group flew high-altitude cover for the invasion fleet. Japanese air attacks tried to reach the ships at low altitude, hugging the waves, specifically to avoid fighting the lightnings in the vertical dimension where they now dominated. It worked, sometimes, but it also meant Japanese strike aircraft spent more time at low altitude, where they were vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire from the fleet. And when they did climb to escape the flak, the P-38 seconds were waiting above them, diving down with altitude advantage and massive speed. On October 24, 1944, Captain Richard Bong, America's highest-scoring ace, was flying combat air patrol over the invasion beaches at 28,000 feet. A formation of 18 Japanese bombers, Ki-49 Helens, tried to reach the fleet at 22,000 feet. Bong's flight of 4 P-38 seconds spotted them, rolled inverted, and dove down with 6,000 feet of altitude advantage. The diving attack destroyed 3 bombers in the first pass. Bong pulled up, climbed back to 30,000 feet in less than 2 minutes, repositioned, and dove again. 2 more bombers fell. The surviving Japanese tried to escape by diving toward the water, but Bong's wingmen followed them down, used their superior dive speed to close distance, then climbed back up faster than the Japanese could pursue. Bong's combat report from that day noted, "Enemy bombers attempted altitude escape to 28,000 feet. Flight maintained pursuit climbing, destroyed 2 additional aircraft at altitude. P-38 liters climb performance exceeded enemy expectations." That phrase, exceeded enemy expectations, appears in dozens of American after-action reports from late 1943 through the end of CAPES, the war. It was dry military language describing a psychological weapon as effective as any bomb or bullet. The Japanese had built their entire fighter doctrine around owning the vertical dimension of air combat. When that advantage evaporated, their tactical playbook became obsolete. But changing doctrine requires time, resources, and most critically, experienced pilots who can adapt to new realities. By 1944, Japan was running out of all 3. The veteran pilots who might have developed new tactics were being killed faster than they could pass on their knowledge. New replacement pilots arrived with a fraction of the training hours their predecessors had received. Before the war, Japanese Navy pilots underwent 700 to 800 hours of flight training before their first combat assignment. By mid-1944, replacement pilots were arriving at frontline units with less than 200 hours of total flight time. They were taught the old tactics, the old doctrine, because there wasn't time or fuel to teach them anything else. So they climbed away from American fighters, just as their instructors had taught them, and they died, because the Americans could now follow them up. In 1942 and early 1943, before the P-38's altitude performance improved, Japanese pilots in the Pacific achieved kill ratios averaging 2 to 3 enemy aircraft destroyed for every Japanese fighter lost. By late 1943, that ratio had dropped to 1 to 1. By mid-1944, it was 1 to 3 against the Japanese. By 1945, it was 1 to 7. Not all of that shift came from the P-38's improved climb rate. American pilots gained experience, numbers, and better tactics. But the Lightning's transformation from altitude liability to altitude predator was a critical inflection point. It removed the Japanese escape option, the one tactical certainty that had kept veteran pilots alive through 18 months of combat. Lieutenant Naoshi Kano, one of Japan's most skilled fighter pilots with 25 confirmed victories, survived until August 3, 1945, longer than almost any of his peers. After the war, in interviews with American historians, he described the moment when he realized the war was lost. It wasn't a massive battle or a carrier sinking. It was a small engagement over Formosa in March 1944. Kano had bounced a pair of P-38 seconds from above, made his pass, and instinctively climbed away as he'd done hundreds of times before. The Americans followed him up. They stayed with him through 29,000 feet, through 32,000, all the way to 35,000. When his Zero finally stalled out, gasping for air in the thin atmosphere, the P-38 seconds were still beside him, their engines still pulling strong. He survived only because the American pilot's guns jammed in the extreme cold at that altitude. When he landed at his base, Kano sat in his cockpit for 10 minutes, unable to move. He later told the interviewer, "I knew then we could not win. The Americans had taken the sky from us. We were fighting on their terms now, and our terms no longer mattered." That psychological defeat, multiplied across hundreds of Japanese pilots, was as strategically significant as any technical advantage. Combat effectiveness doesn't come just from aircraft performance. It comes from pilot confidence, from knowing your capabilities and trusting them absolutely. When that confidence erodes, when doubt creeps into split-second decisions, pilots hesitate, and in air combat, hesitation is death. The P-38's climb rate didn't just kill Japanese pilots. It killed their certainty. It transformed the Pacific sky from a place where Japanese fighters could dictate engagement terms into a place where American fighters owned every dimension of combat. Speed, altitude, firepower, endurance, climb rate. The Zero retained only one advantage, turning radius, and American pilots had learned long ago not to turn with Zeros. By the spring of 1945, the aerial war over the Pacific had become a methodical slaughter. Japanese fighters rose to meet American raids and were systematically destroyed by P-38 seconds that could outclimb them, outgun them, and outlast them in sustained combat. The survivors landed at bases that were running out of fuel, ammunition, and most critically, replacement pilots. The Lightning had evolved from a flawed design with a critical weakness into the most effective high-altitude escort fighter in the Pacific theater, not through a single brilliant innovation, but through the cumulative effect of dozens of improvements, each one building on the last. Field modifications, engineering refinements, better fuel, improved tactics, experienced pilots, all of it coming together in 1944 to produce an aircraft that finally fulfilled its original promise. The P-38 Liters could cruise at 30,000 feet for hours, escort bombers all the way to Japan and back, fight its way through enemy interceptors, and return home with fuel to spare. It could climb to 40,000 feet and loiter there, waiting for targets. It could dive at 600 miles per hour and pull out without the wings tearing off. It could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs and still outfight most enemy interceptors. But more than any technical specification, the P-38 had become a symbol of American industrial and engineering adaptability. It represented the ability to identify a problem, test solutions in the field, and implement improvements faster than the enemy could respond. That cycle of innovation, testing, and refinement was what won the air war in the Pacific. The Japanese had built a brilliant fighter in the Zero, optimized for a specific tactical doctrine. When that doctrine worked, the Zero was devastating. But when circumstances changed, when American fighters evolved to counter Japanese tactics, the Zero had nowhere left to adapt. Its design was fixed. Its light structure couldn't handle more powerful engines. Its short range limited operational flexibility. The P-38, in contrast, had margin built in, robust structure that could handle modifications, twin engines providing redundancy, room for bigger intercoolers, more fuel, heavier armament. the ability to evolve without redesigning from scratch. That adaptability was worth more than any single performance advantage. The transformation was visible in the gun camera footage that American intelligence officers studied through 1944 and early 1945. In footage from 1942 and early 1943, Japanese fighters would break away from engagement by climbing steeply, and the American aircraft in pursuit would fall behind, unable to maintain the climb angle. But footage from late 1943 onward told a different story. Japanese fighters would initiate the same climbing escape, and the pursuing P-38 seconds would stay right behind them, matching their climb angle, sometimes even gaining on them. The final frames of dozens of these films showed Japanese aircraft stalling out at altitude, their pilots having pushed their engines to the breaking point, trying to escape, only to find themselves hanging motionless in the thin air while P-38 seconds closed in for the kill. One particular piece of footage, shot over Balikpapan in October 1944, became required viewing for new P-38 pilots arriving in theatre. It showed a Zero attempting a climbing escape from 26,000 feet. The Japanese pilot executed a perfect chandelle, rolling into a climbing turn that should have taken him safely out of the engagement. The P-38 pilot, Lieutenant Robert de Haven of the 49th Fighter Group, simply followed him up. The camera recorded every second of the pursuit. At 28,000 feet, the Zero's climb rate began to slow. At 30,000, it was barely climbing at 300 feet per minute. At 31,000, it stalled. De Haven's P-38 was still climbing strongly at 2,000 feet per minute. The Zero hung motionless for perhaps 2 seconds, its propeller barely turning, before de Haven's guns tore it apart. The footage ran for 43 seconds total. It had been shown to over 2,000 American pilots by war's end, always with the same commentary. This is what climb performance means. This is why we modified the intercoolers. This is why you're alive and he's not. The technical side of warfare is often reduced to numbers and specifications in history books, but in the cockpit at 30,000 feet, those numbers translated directly into life and death. An extra 500 feet per minute of climb rate didn't sound like much on a specification sheet. In combat, it meant being above your enemy instead of below him. It meant controlling the engagement instead of reacting to it. It meant choosing whether to fight or disengage. For the American pilots who flew those improved P-38 seconds, the change was profound. Major Gerald Johnson of the 49th Fighter Group, who scored 22 victories in the Lightning, later wrote in his memoirs, "Before the J and L models, we fought the Zero on its terms and tried to survive. After the modifications, we fought on our terms and they tried to survive." That's not just a tactical difference, it's psychological dominance. The Japanese understood what had happened, even if they couldn't counter it. Captured documents from late 1944 show Japanese air staff officers analyzing the problem with cold clarity. One report, dated November 19, 1944, stated bluntly, "American P-38 aircraft now demonstrate climb performance equal to or exceeding our Type 0 fighters at all combat altitudes. Previous tactical doctrine, assuming American altitude disadvantage, is no longer valid. Recommend immediate development of replacement fighter with superior high-altitude performance." But recommendations and reality were different things. Japan's aviation industry was already stretched to breaking point, struggling to replace aircraft losses while Allied bombing destroyed factories and supply lines. Developing and producing a new high-altitude fighter would take years Japan didn't have. The Zero pilots would have to keep flying and fighting with an aircraft that had lost its fundamental tactical advantage. Some adapted. The very best Japanese pilots, the aces who survived into late 1944, learned to avoid vertical engagements entirely. They would attack only with overwhelming numerical advantage, make a single high-speed pass, and disengage immediately. No climbing away, no extended combat, just hit, and run. It kept them alive longer, but it also meant they couldn't effectively defend against American bomber raids. The majority of Japanese pilots, especially the poorly trained replacements flooding into combat units through 1945, never adapted. They flew the tactics they'd been taught, climbed away when threatened, and died when the Americans followed them up. The institutional knowledge that might have saved them was trapped in the minds of veteran pilots who were either dead or too scattered across the Pacific to effectively train their replacements. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.